Well, let's go back and look at a little historical perspective.
Okay.
In the Depression in this country, a lot of the banks went under, not because they were poorly managed, but they were insolvent. In other words, they could not meet the demand deposit if you went in and wanted your money
back, yeah.
Beyond a certain level of what they would consider a normal cash requirement. People come and go and might keep 20% in cash. The rest of it was invested in home mortgages in many cases. There were one of the primary reserve investments was railroad bonds, and then utility bonds, and to a lesser extent corporate bonds that met certain standards that the states had set for banks. Well, the people started coming in and wanting their money, and so they would try to go into the market and sell these. Well, everybody else was selling them too. In the meantime, the economic conditions for the railroads particularly were deteriorating. Some of them couldn't pay their bonds when they were due. They couldn't even pay interest on them. The market value of those bonds went down. The banks couldn't sell them. Or if they did, they took such a loss that it just exacerbated their condition and they had to close up. The depositors were wiped out. They couldn't get their money. So I think it was 1930, I know it was in the Hoover administration, they created something called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. And they went in and they bought a lot of these railroad bonds. They didn't pay par, but they paid a market value. In other words, they provided some liquidity to the bank. In some cases that was enough to keep them going, in some cases it wasn't. But that was the first TARP. Okay. They were troubled assets.
So you bought these bonds, so you could say you held something.
Yeah.
And that gave the bank cash. That
gave the bank cash. It was similar to what Fannie and Freddie would do for the banks. The bank originates a mortgage. They package them up. They take them to Freddie. Freddie pays them, buys them, gives the bank cash. They go back and do it again. It's not a troubled asset, but it's the way the banks keep their capital working. So this was an extension of it, that the government would go in and buy these troubled assets. They may be mortgages, loans that may be troubled, and the bank would then get some money and be able to stay in business. So, and it also provided some liquidity in case depositors wanted their money, and they were covered by the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. So the TARP program is not a new idea. It's just that it was a much larger one this time. And it was designed to help get the banks through this period of stress on the mortgage market and on the bond market generally.
And my understanding now is that TARP has been pretty much, most of the banks have paid back this TARP debt.
I don't know what the figures, I know a lot of them have, but I don't know how much the net loss to the taxpayer is going to be.
Well, I heard, and they paid it back with a 10% interest rate. So did we make money on that? You don't know.
Well, if that's the case, they certainly did.
Yeah, nobody was making 10% then.
No, but it was, the idea was to get money into the banks that they could use to meet some of these obligations and to shore up their balance sheet.
Okay, and if it's been pretty much paid back, then that program, and I've heard it, you know, and read it in the journal, it's pretty much been paid back in opinion pages. But there also seems to be, in the process, there's been new regulations put on banks, which seems to be favoring the larger institutions, and because they can borrow money for a lot less rate than these smaller institutions have. So that gives them a great advantage there.
Well, the large banks were the ones that were the most troubled. They had the big loans on there, like General Motors and so on, that were in difficulty, and their payment was questionable. And they were being pressed by the bank examiners who come in and look at all these loans and try to determine if there is a substantial chance of repayment. And if there isn't, the bank has to classify them. That is, they have to take a write-down, which is against their reserve position and reduces their ability to make new loans. So they're taking this write-down. The loan may ultimately work out okay, but for the time being, it's classified as a non-performing loan, or maybe even worse. So the big banks had a lot of those, but small banks do too. And the small banks didn't have quite the access, perhaps, to the Federal Reserve for borrowing purposes that the large banks do. So the small banks were in the same kind of condition because they all had the same kind of loans. And they also, and this is important, I think, that the examiners were coming in and telling them that they had to write these loans down, and when they did that, as I said, their reserve position was impacted and they could make fewer loans as a result of that. Now, I don't think the bank examiners paid much attention to what Congress was saying because they have a job to do. But I think if you talk to the bankers around Brattleboro, they'll tell you that the bank examiners were really squeezing them.
Yes.
And so you had that factor going on. It wasn't widely publicized.
And they might have been squeezing our banks when we really didn't have all those
Yes.
things. Because I have a friend who is on board at a BSNL down in Mount Airy, North Carolina, and he said they were totally liquid. They had good ratios on everything that bankers look at, and TARP came in. Those officials came in and said they had to take TARP, a couple $billion, a couple $1 million worth for a small bank. That's a lot of money.
Yeah.
And they said we don't need to. He said if you don't, you're going to have a run on this bank tomorrow. And it was kind of like they would put something in the press to make it happen if you didn't obey. And they really felt more threatened by the regulators than they did their own money situation.
Well, I think they were trying to avoid, at that point, any kind of a condition that might indicate a run. Because you remember, every week there would be a bank taken over by the FDIC, which meant that the bank office probably stayed there. They had a new name on it, and they were part of a larger bank.
Yeah.
There was a lot of that going on. But that's how the FDIC operates. In the S&L crisis in the early 80s, I guess it was, the FDIC would come into a bank and say, we figure you're not going to make it, and so we're going to merge you with the bank down the street. And in the meantime, everybody gets put out on the street, and we're going to take you over and put you over there. And to the bank down the street, the FDIC said, we wanted you to take this over, and we'll give you some money to do it. We'll help you. And sometimes it meant that the FDIC would take the really bad loans out.
And make it a little more palatable.
Make it a little more palatable to the surviving bank. There were all kinds of ways that they did it, but it was a way to rescue a failing institution.
Okay, so the TARP program, given that you've just told us it was not a new idea, but it seems to worked a little then. It's worked pretty well. Okay, now things are starting to settle down a little bit, and then so that sort of happened. But on top of that, we also have a stimulus program, which was as big, if not bigger, than TARP. I understand not all of it's even been allocated yet, but this was used mostly to be a job creator, I believe. That was the main objective. And it cost us a lot of money.
Not many jobs.
Not many jobs, and or they haven't been permanent jobs. How's this going to work?